In the summer of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army believed it understood the United States Marine Corps. The Americans fought hard, yes, but they were predictable, rigid, linear, obsessed with fixed defenses and firepower. And above all, the Japanese believed the Marines lacked the spiritual ferocity the seishin required for night fighting in the jungle. Guadalcanal, they assumed, would prove this. They were wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But before the world saw the slaughter at Henderson Field in late October, before nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead in front of the Marine and Army lines, Guadalcanal looked less like a turning point and more like a tomb that simply hadn't been closed yet. It began with a decision so reckless it bordered on suicidal. On the morning of August 7th, 1942, 16,000 U.S. Marines hit the beaches of Guadalcanal in the first American offensive of the Pacific War. They expected a brutal landing, machine guns, mortars, and fanatical resistance. Instead, they found half-dug trenches, abandoned cookware, and Japanese construction plans scrawled in the sand. The enemy had simply run. The Japanese had fled inland, leaving behind the half-finished airstrip that would soon define the entire campaign. Henderson Field. For Marines who had trained to die on the beaches, it felt easy, too easy. The real enemy wasn't the Japanese yet. It was the oppressive heat, the disease-ridden swamps, the mosquitoes thick enough to blacken a man's sleeve, and the sensation that the jungle itself was watching. Then the reality hit. On August 9th, the U.S. Navy, stunned by a Japanese night attack, abruptly withdrew. The Marines were left behind, undersupplied, outnumbered, and with no guarantee the fleet was coming back. In one night, the invasion force became an isolated force, and the Japanese seized the opportunity. Tokyo saw the American landing not as a decisive blow, but as a temporary annoyance. The Guadalcanal garrison, now reinforced by the storied 2nd Sendai Division, believed they could wipe out the Marines in a single, decisive night attack. They had done it to the British in Malaya. They had done it to the Dutch in Java. They had done it to the Americans in the Philippines. To them, Guadalcanal was no different. The Japanese command believed passionately in Yasen night battle, the jungle, the darkness, the close quarters fighting. These were not obstacles. These were advantages. Their doctrine was simple. Attack at night. Penetrate the enemy perimeter in small infiltrating columns. Cause panic, disorientation, and collapse. Follow with massed shock units the Kogeki Tai to break whatever remained. Against an enemy that preferred firepower and daylight, it was brutally effective. And so, in the months leading to the decisive October assault, the Japanese launched a series of night attacks that built their confidence and misled them completely. On September 12th and 13th, the Marines faced their first true trial, the Battle of Edson's Ridge, or Bloody Ridge. Colonel Merritt, Red Mike, Edson's raiders, paratroopers, and light infantry held a narrow ridgeline south of Henderson Field. Below them, in the pitch-black jungle, Colonel Kawaguchi's forces assembled more than 3,000 men for a coordinated night attack. What followed was a maelstrom. Japanese columns emerged, screaming, firing, and charging uphill with grenades clenched in their fists. The raiders fought in small pockets, sometimes only seeing the enemy by the muzzle flashes of Japanese rifles. At one point, Edson's line collapsed entirely, and the survivors fell back to a final defensive terrace only yards from the airfield. But the line held. By dawn, more than 800 Japanese troops lay dead around the ridge. The Marines had stopped a full regiment with fewer than 1,000 men. To the Americans, it was a miracle. To the Japanese, it was a misunderstanding. Kawaguchi blamed terrain, miscommunication, and the unfortunate tenacity of the defenders. Tokyo blamed Kawaguchi. No one blamed the doctrine. They believed it would work next time, especially with more men, more artillery, and a division commanded by Lieutenant General Maruyama Masao, a veteran of China who had no intention of repeating Kawaguchi's mistakes. In mid-October, the Japanese committed fully to the recapture of Guadalcanal. The plan was direct. Land the 2nd Division on the island's north coast, march them through the jungle to approach Henderson Field from the south, smash the Marine Army line in a single decisive night assault, overrun the airfield, use it to cut off American resupply. But the march alone almost destroyed them. The route, chosen through the mountains around Mount Austin, was a nightmare. Rations rotted, packs were abandoned, men collapsed from exhaustion, dysentery, and hunger. For days at a time, soldiers survived on a handful of rice. By the time Maruyama's force of approximately 7,000 men reached positions south of Henderson Field, many were already half-starved, fevered, and exhausted. But the Japanese believed spiritual will could overcome physical limits. Maruyama promised his men they would eat American rations at dawn. Opposing them was not a tiny detachment, but a carefully arranged defense composed of 1st Battalion, 7th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry Army under Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hall, elements of the 1st Battalion, 164th Supporting Artillery, the 11th Marines, heavy machine gun sections from the 1st Special Weapons Battalion. This southern line, positioned along a set of forested ridges and ravines, numbered roughly 2,500 Americans in total strength. And unlike earlier in the campaign, the Marines and Army troops now fought side by side, sharing foxholes, water, ammunition, and the unspoken knowledge that if the line broke, there was nothing behind it but the airfield, and beyond the airfield, the sea. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Chesty Puller summed up the situation in his characteristically blunt way. They'll come in screaming. Let 'em. We'll kill 'em all. On October 24th, the Japanese assault was delayed not by the Americans, but by a tropical deluge. Sheets of rain turned ravines into rivers and trails into mud slurries so deep that machine guns had to be carried above the head. Maruyama postponed the attack until the following night. He believed the delay would surprise the Marines. It did not. The Americans could hear the Japanese moving in the jungle. They found scuffed earth, broken foliage, discarded packs. Men along the line whispered, "They're massing. It's going to be big." Puller requested reinforcements. None were available. He ordered every man to stand to at full alert. Shortly after 10 p.m., on October 24th, Japanese flares lit the sky over the jungle canopy. The Americans cramped in muddy foxholes could hear drums, whistles, and the distant chant of, "Ay! Ay! Ay!" The first probing shots cracked through the darkness. Machine gunners tightened their grips. Officers whispered down the line, "Wait. Make them come to you." At around midnight, the jungle erupted. Thousands of Japanese soldiers surged forward in coordinated waves, emerging from the darkness with bayonets fixed, rifles raised, and grenade bags slung across their chests. Their goal: punch through the American line, then roll it up from within. The Americans met them with disciplined fire. The artillery of the 11th Marines, already pre-registered on key approaches, began pounding the Japanese columns with high explosive shells. Heavy machine guns opened up with red-hot tracers. Rifle fire snapped in tight, controlled volleys. But the Japanese kept coming. Some columns bypassed fire entirely, slipping through gullies and ravines to strike at weak points, just as their doctrine demanded. And in one sector, they nearly succeeded. The first hours of the Japanese assault were a storm of sound rifle cracks, mortar thumps, the ripping thunder of machine guns, but at the southern sector of the American perimeter, the fighting soon became something else entirely. Silent. Not because the battle quieted, but because it moved so close that rifles were useless. Shortly after 1:30 a.m., a Japanese assault column later identified as elements of Colonel Shoji's 124th Infantry Regiment slipped through a ravine between Company F and Company G of the 164th Infantry. Torrential rain and thick jungle muffled their movement. One moment the American line was intact, the next, a wedge of Japanese troops were behind it. It was the nightmare scenario. A corporal with the 164th later said, "You didn't hear them before they were on top of you. 1 second we were staring into the dark. The next, there were bayonets in the foxholes. Japanese soldiers poured through the gap, firing wildly and yelling, "Teikoku Banzai," as they charged toward the battalion command post, and beyond it, the open path to Henderson Field. For a few minutes, it looked like the line had finally cracked. He was at his command post on a narrow jungle track when a blood-soaked runner burst from the darkness shouting, "They're through! They're in the perimeter!" Puller didn't hesitate. He grabbed the nearest weapon, a .30 caliber water-cooled Browning machine gun, and began hauling it toward the sound of the fighting. Marines from nearby rifle platoons fell in behind him. What followed was not an orderly maneuver, but a violent, improvised counterattack. A handful of Marines charging directly into a Japanese penetration that threatened to unravel the entire southern defense. One Marine later recalled, "Puller was shouting over the gunfire, 'Come on, get up here!' And we went. He wasn't asking. The counterattack hit the Japanese column head-on. Puller's Marines fired point-blank into the massed shapes moving through the rain. Grenades arced overhead. Bayonets clashed in the mud. By 2 a.m., the gap was sealed. But the night was far from over. What the Americans had fought so far wasn't the main attack, only the probing elements. At 2:30 a.m., the real assault began. Out of the jungle to the south, more than 2,000 soldiers of the Sendai Division surged forward in dense shockwaves. They were driven by desperation, starvation, exhaustion, and the belief that their only hope of is naught. Survival was to break the American line and seize the airfield before dawn. The terrain funneled them directly at the positions of the 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry, supported by elements of Puller's 1/7th Marines. It was as close to a perfect Japanese night attack scenario as they had ever achieved on Guadalcanal. The Americans met it with a wall of steel. The 11th Marines unleashed massed pre-registered artillery that detonated in sheets of flame. Mortars from the Special Weapons Battalion dropped a constant stream of 60mm and 81mm shells into the ravines. Heavy machine guns M1917S and M1919S fired until their barrels glowed, were swapped, and glowed again. But still, the Japanese came. A Marine gunner later said, "We'd drop a whole belt into the black and the screams would start. But minutes later, another wave would come right through the smoke." By 3 a.m., the battlefield had degraded into what veterans later described as a killing corridor, a narrow, jungle-lined avenue where Japanese troops attempted to force a breakthrough and instead smashed headlong into layer upon layer of coordinated fire. Infantrymen held their positions by tactile memory, working bolts, clearing jams, and firing into shadows only 10 to 20 yards away. Some Japanese troops crawled through mud to get inside the American lines. Others played dead until Marines passed, then stabbed them from behind. A private in the 164th wrote, "I killed men so close to me I could feel the heat of their bodies as they fell." The Japanese were not merely brave, they were disciplined. Officers blew shrill whistles that signaled fresh waves to rise and charge despite the carnage. Runners relayed shouted commands. Standards were raised and lowered in the dark, but the American defense was ruthless and unbroken. As the fighting intensified, several American machine gun sections became critical. The most famous was Sergeant John Bazalone's 1/7th Marine Machine Gun Platoon, positioned a bit east of the 164th line. Though technically outside the core southern sector we're focusing on, Bazalone's actions illustrate the scale of the assault and the punishment delivered. Bazalone's guns fired almost continuously through the night. Barrels were changed until there were none left to change. Teams ran ammunition forward under fire. When the guns overheated beyond use, Bazalone personally carried 50-pound ammunition belts across terrain thick with Japanese attacking forces. His area of the line held. So did the rest. At around 4 a.m., the Japanese High Command sector radioed forward units with a message. The dawn attack will finish the enemy. But there would be no dawn attack. The shock columns had been shredded. The units were disorganized, leaderless, and exhausted. The jungle floor was carpeted with bodies, some dead, many wounded who would not survive the day. And still, Maruyama did not understand the scale of the disaster. Japanese. Doctrine assumed that a night attack could not fail if carried out with spiritual will. If it had failed, it must have been due to poor execution. So Maruyama ordered a second attack. As daylight spread across the soaked ridges and ravines, the battlefield came into stark relief. Marines stared at the dead hundreds of Japanese soldiers lying in heaps, along trails, beside machine gun nests, and piled against barbed wire. Some American units reported so many bodies in front of their foxholes that they had to shove them aside with rifles just to maintain a field of fire. And then, impossibly, the Japanese attacked again. At mid-morning on October 25, remnants of the Sendai Division attempted a disorganized, desperate charge toward the same sector. They advanced with fixed bayonets, but they were walking into a fully awake, fully supplied American line. Artillery spotted them first. Mortars bracketed them second. Machine guns and rifles finished the rest. Disintegrated almost immediately. A 2nd Division survivor later wrote, "It was not a battle, it was annihilation." By noon on October 25, the battlefield had grown eerily quiet. Marine patrols moved forward cautiously, stepping over bodies and abandoned weapons. The rain pooled in shell craters and washed through the ravines red with runoff. What they found was staggering. More than 1,500 Japanese killed in front of the 164th and 1/7th positions. Hundreds more dead deeper in the jungle. Severely wounded Japanese soldiers who had no medical support, many too weak to move. Weapons, packs, and personal diaries scattered everywhere. In total, across the entire Maruyama offensive, the Japanese suffered approximately 3,000 combat deaths, the largest single Japanese loss in a ground assault to that point in the Pacific War. The Americans had held the line, and they had held it with discipline, coordination, and overwhelming defensive firepower, not with the 440 Marines of a dramatic headline, but with the full 2,500-strong integrated force of Marines, Army infantry, artillerymen, machine gunners, engineers, and support crews working in unbroken concert. But the battle was not over. A defeated Japanese division was not a dead one. The jungle still hid thousands of starving, desperate soldiers who refused to accept that Henderson Field could not be taken. Dawn on the 26th of October brought no celebration, only exhaustion. The men who had held the Southern Line, Marines and soldiers alike, sat in mud-filled foxholes, staring across ground they had defended for 2 nights without sleep. The air stank of cordite, burned cloth, and decay. Steam rose from the jungle floor, where hundreds of bodies lay in tangled masses. Yet every man knew the same grim truth. The fighting was not finished. The Sendai Division had not simply disappeared. Thousands of Japanese soldiers still remained in the ridges and ravines east of the American perimeter. Many were wounded, many starving, some delirious, but they were still armed, still dangerous, still capable of slipping behind the lines if left untouched. Command understood this. General Vandergrift and the staff of the 1st Marine Division issued orders before noon. Patrol aggressively, push outward, locate survivors of Maruyama's shattered force, and prevent any reorganization. The Japanese were no longer a striking force, they were a broken army drifting through the jungle in scattered fragments. But fragments can still kill. The initial patrols moved with caution. The jungle was silent, almost unnaturally so, as if the previous nights had wrung all sound from it. In one ravine, a patrol from the 3rd Battalion 164th Infantry found more than 100 Japanese bodies piled in a natural choke point, all killed in the artillery barrage that had crushed the second attack. Their uniforms were torn by shrapnel, their rifles lay in mud beside them. Some had died, huddled together, still gripping their packs. Others lay alone in the brush where they had crawled after being wounded. Survivors were found too. A Marine reconnaissance team discovered several Japanese soldiers who had collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. They offered no resistance, only a blank stare, too weak even to lift their weapons. In another sector, a patrol came under sudden fire from a group hiding behind fallen logs. The exchange lasted less than a minute. When it was over, the Americans found diaries soaked by the constant rain. Many entries recorded the same theme: hunger, confusion, and the expectation that the final attack would surely capture the airfield. One entry, written only a day before the attack, read, "If we seize the American base, our suffering will end. If not, we vanish on this island." The Japanese high command position farther to the southeast was in equal disarray. Runners sent to locate Colonel Maruyama's regimental leaders returned, with only fragments of reports. Units that had begun the assault with several hundred men now reported only dozens. Some companies had ceased to exist entirely. The commanding officers still alive attempted to re-establish control, but every hour brought confirmation that the offensive had failed beyond recovery. Yet retreat was not a simple matter. The jungle east of Henderson Field was a maze of ridges that funneled movement into predictable routes, and the Americans, now confident and aggressive, pushed patrols into those same routes. Small clashes erupted continuously through the day. A Japanese company attempting to regroup walked directly into a Marine ambush near the crest of Hill 17. Another, even smaller cluster was found attempting to treat wounded men with improvised bandages torn from their own uniforms. The Americans hesitated only a second before ordering surrender. None was offered. They fought until they were cut down. By the afternoon of the 26th, American commanders realized that what remained of the Sendai Division was drifting eastward toward the coastal plains near Coley Point. If those scattered forces were allowed to reassemble, the Japanese might not mount a new assault immediately, but they could still threaten patrol lines, supply routes, or even attempt a small-scale infiltration of the perimeter. Henderson Field could not operate with that kind of uncertainty. The airfield was the lifeline of the entire Solomons campaign. Any threat, no matter how small, had to be eliminated. The order went out: pursue. The units tasked with the pursuit were a mix of Marines, Army infantry, and scouts familiar with the terrain. In the coming days they would clash with remnants of the 2nd Division along streams, on narrow ridges, and in thickets so dense that visibility shrank to only a few feet. Often there was no battle at all, only the discovery of men who had simply collapsed and died from wounds, disease, or starvation. Japanese supply lines had broken long before the attack. Many soldiers had eaten nothing for days before they even charged the American lines. Rainfall turned the trails into sucking mud that pulled at boots and reduced movement to a crawl. Even among seasoned Marines, the sight of the devastation left by the battle shocked them. A lieutenant with the 164th later wrote, "I knew war was brutal. I did not know until then how completely a night fight could destroy an army." As the days passed, what remained of Maruyama's force continued eastward until there was no force left at all, only scattered survivors, limping toward the Matanikau region or deeper into the interior. A Japanese staff officer who eventually reached friendly lines described the retreat as a march through the land of the dead. For the Americans, the significance of what they had accomplished began to settle only slowly. Every man understood that the southern line had held. That much was clear. But it would take time to understand what that truly meant. The Japanese had thrown their finest infantry division at the perimeter. These soldiers had been trained in Manchuria, hardened in earlier campaigns, and prepared for a decisive breakthrough at Guadalcanal. Yet the combined force of Marines and Army infantry, supported by artillery, mortars, and coordinated fire discipline, had stopped them cold. This was not merely a tactical victory, it was a strategic turning point. The capture and defense of Henderson Field meant that American aircraft could operate freely over the Solomons, severing Japanese supply lines and isolating garrisons that once relied on night resupply runs. It meant that the Tokyo Express could no longer deliver men in numbers sufficient to reverse the tide. It meant that, for the first time in the Pacific War, a major Japanese offensive had failed completely. In the weeks that followed, the men who had fought on the southern line returned to their routines repairing foxholes, patrolling the perimeter, eating rations that tasted increasingly strange after days of adrenaline and rainwater. The jungle did not grow quieter, but their fear of the great assault slowly faded. They had endured the worst the enemy could deliver, and the line had held. Years later, many veterans of that night would struggle to explain what it felt like. They remembered Flash's barrel smoke drifting in rain, the thud of mud under charging feet, the weight of machine gun belts slung over shoulders, the momentary shock of seeing forms appear through darkness only yards away. But when asked how they managed to hold, they almost always answered with the same understated clarity. We were never alone on that line. Not 400 Marines, not 5,000 attackers, but thousands of Americans, Marines, soldiers, artillery crews, machine gunners, drivers, mortar teams, engineers, all part of a defense that had absorbed the fury of an entire division and had not broken. The jungle south of Henderson Field remained scarred by the battle, but for those who survived it, the memory was carried far longer than the marks left on the earth. And in the broader sweep of the Pacific War, the defense of Henderson Field marked a threshold. After those nights in late October, the initiative shifted. The Japanese would attack again on Guadalcanal, but never with the same belief that victory was inevitable. The Americans, for their part, gained a confidence that would carry them through the long, brutal island campaigns that lay ahead. The Southern Line had not only saved the airfield, it had demonstrated something far more consequential, that the Imperial Japanese Army, considered unstoppable in the early months of the war, could be met head-on, shattered, and turned back, not by luck, not by numbers, but by preparation, discipline, and the unbreakable resolve of men who refused to yield even an inch of mud to the darkness pressing against them. In the weeks after the battle, the jungle began reclaiming what had been torn apart. Vines crept over shattered trees, rain rinsed the soil clean of smoke, and insects returned to a landscape that only days earlier had been filled with fire and death. But for the men on Guadalcanal, there was no sense of renewal, only the slow drag of exhaustion settling deeper into their bones. The victory at Henderson Field had not lifted the burden of the campaign. It had simply ensured that the burden would continue. Every man understood that. They had held the line, stopped a major offensive, and crippled one of Japan's best divisions, but the war around them had not ended. On the contrary, it seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The lull after the battle felt unnatural. The nights were still humid, still punctuated by the occasional burst of gunfire or the chittering of insects, but the frantic, razor's-edge tension of the previous weeks had eased. Some men found themselves waking in the middle of the night expecting to hear the pounding feet of a charge, only to realize with a jolt that the jungle was quiet. Others, unable to sleep, simply sat in their foxholes staring into the darkness, trying to understand how they had survived. Mail finally caught up with the units on the front. Some men tore open envelopes with shaking hands, holding on to news from home like it was oxygen. Others tucked letters into their packs unread, unable to connect the normalcy of the words with the reality around them. A corporal from the 7th Marines received a letter from his sister describing the first snowfall of the year in Montana. He folded it neatly, placed it in his pocket, and whispered, "I can't even remember what cold feels like." Replacements began arriving not in great numbers, but enough to fill out depleted companies. They were pale from the voyage, wide-eyed, and visibly disturbed by the way the veterans moved through camp, quiet, watchful, reacting sharply to sudden noises. The newcomers had heard rumors that the fighting on Guadalcanal was intense, but rumors rarely communicated the truth. When they walked the ground where the southern line had been held, they did so slowly, realizing from the churned earth and burned brush that they were standing in a place where hundreds had fought and died in the span of minutes. Some veterans tried to explain what had happened. Most did not. It wasn't secrecy. It was that the events of the night were too tangled to put into simple words. How do you describe firing at shapes you could barely see? How do you explain the strange clarity that comes when you realize that only a few dozen yards separate you from an entire division trying to kill you? The newcomers listened with a mixture of awe and disbelief, sensing that the men who had fought in the battle spoke differently, now leaner in emotion, sharper in memory, older in a way that had nothing to do with years. As the perimeter stabilized, engineers worked to repair the damage inflicted on Henderson Field. Cratered sections of the runway were filled, metal matting was laid down, and aircraft resumed operations more regularly. Every roar of engines taking off felt like a reassurance. The Cactus Air Force, a worn, fractious mix of Marine, Navy, and Army planes, had grown into something far more formidable. The pilots who flew overhead were no longer scrambling against overwhelming odds, but striking Japanese transports, bombers, and supply ships with increasing confidence. The Japanese, for their part, struggled to comprehend the scale of their defeat. Reports filtered back through the remaining chain of command, each one worse than the last. Accurate casualty numbers were impossible to compile, but even the most conservative estimates made one fact unmistakable. The division was broken. Officers who had believed that American defenses were thinly held and demoralized now realized, too late, that they had attacked, a position prepared, supported, and strengthened by men unwilling to break. Still, the Japanese were not ready to abandon Guadalcanal. High command in Rabaul sought ways to reinforce the island, even if that meant sending men on destroyers through the deadly gauntlet of American air power. Supply ships attempted night runs that often ended in flames under the bombs of Cactus Squadron. Food became scarce among Japanese units, still scattered in the interior. One Marine scout team found a group of enemy soldiers so emaciated that their uniforms hung from their bodies like wet cloth. The soldiers fought anyway. Hunger had stripped them down to the last threads of life, but their will to resist had not evaporated. The Americans tracked these wandering remnants. Patrols moved deeper into the interior, pushing toward the steep, twisting valleys east of the Matanikau. Rain came down in sudden sheets, soaking packs and clogging rifles with mud. Even so, every step forward felt like reclaiming a small piece of the initiative seized during the battle. One night, a platoon from the 164th Infantry set up a temporary bivouac near a ridge where the trees formed a canopy so thick that not even moonlight filtered through. As they settled, a soft clinking was heard somewhere in the darkness, the unmistakable sound of a canteen brushing against metal. The men froze. For a moment they wondered if it was one of their own returning from the bushes. Then a low voice, speaking hurried Japanese, carried through the air. The platoon leader signaled silently. Rifles were lifted. Safeties clicked off. When the clash came, it was brief and violent. A handful of Japanese soldiers had been trying to make their way east, likely searching for food or attempting to reconnect with their shattered units. The fight lasted less than a minute. When it was over, the Americans stood in silence, listening for any sign of reinforcements. None came. Encounters like this became common. If the battle for Henderson Field had been a firestorm, the aftermath was a slow, grinding erosion of what remained of the Japanese presence in the region. And yet even amid the constant patrols and sporadic clashes, the Americans did something strange. They built. They improved bunkers, laid new communication lines, strengthened machine gun nests, and expanded supply dumps. This wasn't simply preparation for the next fight, it was an assertion of permanence. They were no longer holding an isolated strip of land against overwhelming odds. They were establishing a foothold from which the rest of the campaign in the Solomons would unfold. Many later remembered this period not for the gunfire or the patrols, but for the emotional weight that settled over them, the strange mixture of relief, grief, pride, and dread. They had survived the worst night of the campaign, but survival came with a question none could quite answer. If they had lived through that, what else might still be asked of them? For, now, though, Henderson Field stood firmly in American hands. The men who defended it had altered the course of the war, even if most of them didn't yet realize it. They were too busy repairing gear, cleaning weapons, writing letters home, and preparing for the next unknown day in a campaign that seemed determined to test them again and again. And though the jungle had grown quiet, they knew better than to trust its silence. The quiet that followed the battle was deceptive, and everyone on Guadalcanal felt it. Even the men who had fought through the worst of it, the machine gunners from Edson's Ridge, the riflemen of the 164th, the mortar crews who had fired until their tubes glowed red, knew the island had a way of punishing anyone who let their guard down. Victory did not mean safety. It meant time to breathe, time to rebuild, time to wait for whatever the enemy might attempt next. Those first weeks of November brought a strange mixture of routine and tension. Foxholes were dug deeper, firing arcs adjusted, new fields of fire cleared with machetes. Each company took turns rotating toward the front, then pulling back to rest, though rest was an optimistic word. The oppressive humidity, the persistent insects, and the ever-present stench of rotting vegetation made comfort impossible. Some men developed jungle rot so severe their boots stuck to their skin when removed. Others coughed constantly, their lungs weakened by weeks of moisture and exhaustion. But even in the misery, there were moments of almost surreal calm. A Marine scout wrote that one morning he watched a pair of parrots settle on a broken tree limb, only yards from where a dozen men had died. They looked at us, he wrote, tilted their heads like we were the strange ones, then flew off like nothing had happened. The jungle did not mourn, it simply moved on. As the Americans repaired and reinforced their positions, the Japanese command made a decision that seemed incomprehensible to the men in the field. They would try again. They would send additional troops, more artillery, more destroyers through the slot. The Emperor's army did not accept defeat easily, and Guadalcanal, this humid, disease-ridden scrap of earth, had become a matter of national pride. But pride did not replace calories, and by early November, the scattered remnants of the Sendai division were starving. Patrols near the Ingela Channel found men who had died with grass still in their mouths. Others had attempted to chew strips of their leather equipment. The Japanese command attempted to resupply the island by destroyer, but Henderson Field had grown too dangerous. American aircraft, repaired and reinforced, now struck nearly every ship that approached in daylight. Even at night, the waters around the island had become a graveyard of burning hulls. Meanwhile, the Americans grew stronger. More troops, fresh and unweathered, arrived via slow convoys. They brought crates of ammunition, mortar rounds, heavy machine guns, and weeks' worth of rations. A Marine sergeant who had survived the October assault recalled seeing a new batch of soldiers unloading crates of canned peaches. "I almost cried," he said years later, not because of the peaches, but because someone had finally given us enough food to stop thinking about it. But the lull did not fool seasoned men. The veterans could feel something shifting, an uneasiness carried on the wind, the sense that the next storm was gathering offshore. Recon aircraft spotted Japanese ships massing far to the north. Scouts reported increased movement in the interior. And the Tokyo Express, its destroyers bruised but not broken, kept trying to slip supplies through the narrow waters north of the island. Each attempt told the Americans the same thing. The enemy was not finished. On the night of November 12th, as a warm rain drifted over the perimeter, a Marine listening post heard distant explosions, echoing across the water deep, rolling impacts that rattled the earth like distant thunder. They didn't know it yet, but American naval forces were clashing with Japanese battleships in one of the most chaotic night engagements of the Pacific War. Henderson Field's survival was once again at stake, not from infantry charging through the jungle, but from heavy naval guns aimed at annihilating the runway from miles offshore. The men on shore could do nothing but wait. The sound of the battle carried for hours sharp cracks of naval guns, dull roars of explosions, and occasional flashes of light far beyond the horizon. Some men tried to sleep. Others sat silently, staring into the dark. A few prayed in whispers, not loudly enough for anyone else to hear. When dawn broke, smoke hung over the distant waters. The radio crackled with scattered reports. American ships had taken losses, but the battleships sent to flatten Henderson Field had been driven off. The airfield still stood. Henderson was alive, damaged, cratered in places, but alive. And within hours, American planes lifted into the sky again, their engines echoing like a promise. The victory at Henderson Field in October had done more than stop a single attack. It had shifted the momentum of the entire campaign. Now, in November, the Japanese were fighting at a disadvantage they had never experienced in the early months of the war. They were out of food, out of time, and increasingly out of ships. Yet they persisted, driven not by strategy but by the belief that Guadalcanal could not be lost. But the Americans sensed something the Japanese command refused to admit. The island was tipping, not easily, not quickly, but undeniably. The initiative was changing hands. The line that the Marines and soldiers had held in the mud during those brutal nights in October had become the hinge upon which the entire Solomon's campaign now turned. Still, for the men living it, these were just days, hot, wet, exhausting, days filled with patrols, repairs, and the constant knowledge that death could emerge from any shadow. They did not see themselves as part of a great turning point. They were simply doing the work necessary to survive the next sunrise. But history saw them differently, and soon, the battle that would follow one of the fiercest and closest-run naval air-ground struggles of the Pacific would prove just how much their stand in October had mattered. The naval battle offshore had shaken every man on Guadalcanal. But when the smoke finally lifted and the rumble of distant guns faded, the soldiers and Marines returned to the same grim rhythm that defined life on the island. The Japanese were wounded, starving, and increasingly desperate, yet the Americans knew that a wounded enemy was often the most dangerous. No one assumed the campaign was nearing an end. If anything, the tension felt tighter than before. Henderson Field operated, but barely. Craters still marked parts of the runway, and repair crews worked day and night to keep it functional. Every time an aircraft touched down, the ground crews flinched, ready for a wheel to hit a soft patch or a weakened section of metal matting. But the planes kept flying, and with each sortie the Americans further strangled Japanese attempts to reinforce their troops. In the jungles east of the perimeter, patrols kept encountering small bands of Japanese soldiers. Most were gaunt, their cheeks sunken, their uniforms hanging like rags. Some resisted fiercely despite their condition. Others fled at the first sign of contact, often leaving behind rifles, packs, or letters soaked through with rain. The letters were heartbreaking messages of determination, fear, and longing, many addressed to families who would never hear from their sons again. Even with the Japanese presence thinning, no one felt secure. One afternoon, a Marine squad moving along the Tenaru stumbled into an ambush set by fewer than a dozen Japanese riflemen. The Tenaru firefight lasted just moments, but 2 Marines were killed instantly. The shock rattled the squad. How could men so weak still fight with such ferocity? The answer came from a captain who had been on the island since the first landings. "Because they think dying here is better than going home a failure," he said. Nighttime brought its own anxieties. The moon would rise over the palms, casting long shadows across the perimeter. Every rustle in the brush made men clutch their rifles tighter. Sometimes it was only a lizard or a bird. Sometimes it was a Japanese scout probing for weaknesses. A few nights, the tension was broken by sudden flares, as nervous sentries opened fire at imagined shapes. After each burst, silence settled again, heavy and suffocating. Back at the airfield, the men began to grasp just how important their victory in October had been. Supply convoys arrived with slightly more regularity. A few tents were expanded. Food rations increased, though they were still far from plentiful. The men joked that Guadalcanal was the only place on Earth where a can of cold hash could taste like a gift. But no one believed the Japanese had given up. They had failed to break the perimeter, failed to destroy Henderson, failed to starve the defenders, but they had not stopped coming. Every day brought new rumours of movement in the hills or ships gathering in the north, and so the men prepared, not with bravado, not with speeches or declarations, but with quiet efficiency. Rifles were cleaned, magazines filled, fighting holes reinforced. The veterans moved with the weary steadiness of men who knew exactly what another assault would look like and knew they would face it all again if necessary. They were tired, battered, and far from home, but they had held once, and if the Japanese came again, they were ready to hold again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.